IntangibleEconomies that Philip, the publishing organization based in Vancouver, initiated in 2011. Yes, 2011. And it's something that particularly Antonia Hirsch, who's an editor-at-large of Philip, initiated with a kind of conference event in Vancouver in 2011. And that led to, I think, discussions around how the papers produced for that conference would be brought together into publication. And so tonight's event really is the opportunity to revisit this project due to the publishing of the compilation of texts. We, Artispace, also did an event with Antonia as part of the Intangible Economies series in Berlin last year, so it's very good and nice for us to have an opportunity to revisit this project with a different group of speakers this time. So tonight, Antonia Hirsch, who is an artist based in Berlin, will be introducing the Intangible Economies project, followed by presentations from Candice Hopkins and Patricia Reed. So we're very grateful for them for being here. So I'm just going to give you a kind of formal introduction to the three speakers. Before I do so, each paper tonight is quite lengthy. There won't be really a formal opportunity for questions after each one because we want to move on and keep moving. But please do, if you have any pressing questions whilst the talks are unfolding, then do stick your hand in the air, but also retain questions for afterwards. We're going to do two presentations, Antonia's and Candice's first, and then have a short break where there'll be some food available as well before moving on to Patricia's. So Antonia Hirsch is, as I said, an artist based in Berlin and also editor-at-large at Philip. Her work has been exhibited at the Contemporary Art Gallery of Vancouver, the Power Plant Toronto, and the Taipei Fine Arts Museum, Tramway in Glasgow, and ZKM Museum of Contemporary Art in Karlsruhe, amongst others. Her writing and projects have appeared in publications including Arte Contexto, C Magazine, Philip, and The Happy Hypocrite. Candice Hopkins is an independent curator and writer based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Ottawa, Canada. She's held curatorial positions at the National Gallery of Canada, the Western Front, and the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Centre. And her writings on art, history, and vernacular architecture have been published by MIT Press, Revolver Press, and Philip, amongst others. She has lectured at venues including Witte de Witt, Tate, the Dakar Biennial, and Documenta 13. And Patricia Reed is a Berlin-based artist and writer who has exhibited at Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, Program in Berlin, and Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions in LA, and Kunsthaus Lagentels in Switzerland, amongst others. As a writer, she has contributed essays to publications including Waking Up from the Nightmare of Participation, published by Sternberg Press, and The Archive as a Productive Space of Conflict, published by Karlsruhe University of Arts and Design. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Antonia to give an introduction, a more broader introduction to Intangible Economies. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks for the introduction, and can you hear me okay? Do this a little bit more like that. First of all, I of course want to do the obligatory but also heartfelt thanks to Artispace and particularly Richard for having us here. Like you said, for the next half hour or so I will introduce the Intangible Economies project, its scope and the sort of major ideas that animate the overall project. I just briefly first want to say a few words about Philip. Philip is best known, I think, for Philip magazine that it publishes twice a year. But we also do a whole bunch of other things that are somewhat difficult to classify sometimes. We put on conferences. Just this past fall, we had the Institutions by Artists conference in Vancouver, usually in Vancouver, which also resulted in one of these folio series books. As Richard already mentioned, Intangible Economies also involved a conference, and we did a conference, I think 2 years prior to that, which was called Judgment and Contemporary Art Criticism, which looked at art criticism today. We also do stuff like publishing artist projects. We put on performances, musical performances. There's a lot of stuff. I encourage you to look at the website, which is philip.ca. And there's a whole number of podcasts as well, where you can sort of look through the archives if you're interested. So today, as Richard already mentioned, we're just having a sort of small section of the project with two of the contributors, Candace Hopkins and Patricia Reed. I do want to speak a little bit about how the whole project came together, partially because I think it's sort of exemplary also of the ideas that the project addresses. So as you've maybe already read in the short blurb about this event, Intangible Economies is a project that conceives of economy as a general system of exchange and that speculatively investigates the role that affective transactions play in modes of representation and in cultural production. And I would say there's an emphasis on speculatively. None of us are economists or anything like that. There's a mixture of artists, writers, curators that came to this topic and really sort of tackled it on their own terms, which I think was very important. So aside from being about ideas about affect and economy, the project itself also enacts the circulation of ideas, in a way an economy of ideas, and how they get exchanged and how their value is established. The project itself started originally as a sort of solitary research project of mine, where I was at the time temporarily based in Berlin. And although I speak German, I mostly read and write in English. And so I was faced with the problem of where I would get my material from. And I didn't want to buy all my books or spend a lot of time trying to find English language libraries. So what happened was I actually approached friends of mine that I thought were likely to have relevant books, and borrowed a whole bunch of books. And in my temporary sublet, after a short period of time, I had a pretty nice special topic library, which then fed into another project of mine, which is the Surplus Library of Affect and Economic Exchange. And if you're interested, I can tell you later more about that. But what that meant was that I already had sort of, by borrowing, of course you don't borrow books mutely, but you talk about why you have that book or why you want to borrow it, what ideas it might have generated, and so on. And so there were discussions already starting to happen. And we already had a kind of affective network there, or it came about through this borrowing and lending that I found quite interesting. It's a sort of, it was the borrowing and lending of ideas, circulation of ideas. And many of the people who were involved in this initial borrowing and lending process also later became contributors to the project. The discussions I had with people were, of course, sort of casual, but already I noticed that there were some really valuable thoughts, really amazing ideas sort of being mentioned, and I was quite interested in formalizing this more, and particularly to make them more broadly accessible. And what also was interesting in this process was that I, in my own, like when you research something alone, you have a preconceived idea of what you're going to address, but as soon as you talk with other people, of course, they start to remap the territory that you want to address. And that was kind of an interesting process where like I say, they sort of helped define my concept even of what this whole thing could be. But at the same time, then when we also decided to kind of go public with it, I also had to map out a little bit more what the sort of main areas that I wanted to see addressed could be. Sorry. Do have to go with my notes here. So basically what I then ended up doing is I gave people, sort of based on the conversations we had, a brief in a way, but it was just an idea that I proposed to them, and then what ensued was a dialogue where things could go. But basically I just gave them one rule. I said I don't want anything about the art market. I'm not interested in that. And the point of that was that I wasn't so interested in looking at economy in terms of product in the cultural sector, but in terms of production and generation of stuff. And so the art market was a no-no. And I think I was worried that it would become too much about market mechanics. I was interested about something else there, or in something else there. So ultimately the project ended up including contributions by 9 artists, writers, and curators, and those were Juan Gaitan, or R, I should say, Melanie Gilligan, Hadley Maxwell, Candace Hopkins, who will be speaking later, Olaf Nicolai, Patricia Reed, who will also make a presentation today, Monika Szewczak, and Jan Verwoerd, and of course myself. Initially, the whole enterprise sort of took the form of a series of essays that we published in Philip magazine, issue 13 to 16. And then, as Richard mentioned, we had this forum in Vancouver, which kind of offered an opportunity for the contributors to kind of workshop also their ideas. Sometimes they had made changes. Hadley and Maxwell developed a whole kind of performative way of presenting their ideas. And the book finally brought it all sort of, well, in a way to a close, I would say, but it was really important, I think, for everyone to have this workshopping idea. It was really not trying so much, again, to put out a product, but to really involve also the audiences in developing this project. And I have to say we were extremely lucky in Vancouver, where audiences are very critically minded, and very generous at the same time. So in the book, actually, there's a transcript section at the end that's really, I think, quite interesting, where those voices are also registered. So 2 of the contributors of the overall project take a bit of a special role. Like I said, most of the people initially I knew were part of my social circle, except for Melanie Gilligan, who was somebody I did not know personally. I just knew of her work and her writing. And I was really interested in what she was doing, because not only did she seem to have an exceptionally good grasp of the sort of conventional mechanisms of a fiscal economy, but she was also keenly interested in sense experience with relation to economy, as odd that might seem, and that actually ended up playing a very, very significant role at the forum, and you will see that also reflected again in the essays of the book. The other odd one out was Patricia Reed, whom we are hearing today. I invited her to contribute an essay basically after we'd already gone through the conference, because there was another topic that was really seemed to be quite dominant in the whole discussion, and that hadn't been explicitly addressed by any of the other contributors. And that was the question of economy in regard to, or ethics in regard to economy. And so in very simple terms, I personally was curious about how we could speak of value, both as a concept in fiscal economies and in the realm of ethics. And importantly, I don't mean ethical economics. That's not what we're talking about here. I really mean the concept of value that is shared by both ethics and economics, but presumably the fact that this term is used in both contexts is not accidental, but how those two can actually relate, I think, is a really interesting and crucial question. And I don't know if I'm misrepresenting you, but I'm definitely presenting this in a much less nuanced way, as you will later do today. And yeah, so that was basically the essay that sort of was there to kind of round out the overall project. Intangible economies originally took its departure against the background of the broader economic situation of 2008. And while in some ways the crisis seemed not to fully unfold until sometime after its 2007-2008 onset, by 2010 the effects seemed to have filtered down into the lives of most. And in the cultural sector, for example, this manifested, as I'm sure we all know, in the collapse of the art market, drastic funding cuts, a difficult job market that severely impacted cultural producers, the so-called artistic precariat, and that sort of helped for people to eke out a living, with sort of casual jobs and so on. So even that had a pretty dramatic impact. So this economic crisis has now lasted for half a decade, which is perhaps slightly surprising given that capitalism's paradigmatic push towards growth usually induces the sort of optimism that seems to manufacture its own realities. And Candace, actually in her talk, will speak later to how this type of self-fulfilling prophecy has a pretty long history. However, it is perhaps the persistence of the current crisis that has enabled a more thorough and sustained discussion in terms such as value, credit, debt, and exchange. In fact, it may have permitted a rethinking of these terms' signification, allowing older texts and discussions to be reconsidered in a contemporary context, and begging the question, when does a crisis become the new normal? Something not to be overcome, but rather inhabited as a new reality. Considering that we inevitably find ourselves in the midst of history, a history in the making, the Intangible Economies project also attempts to broach the ideas around economies and around crises from a variety of perspectives. So primarily in order to emphasize the fact that this new normal we live in now is one normal and not the normal. To this end, you will find, for example, also in the book, an extended conversation between myself and Olaf Nicolai, who was socialized as an artist in the former GDR, the German Democratic Republic, the socialist system that collapsed in 1989. And his experience of the interconnection between a non-capitalist socialist worldview and cultural production, particularly regarding how it impacted his own conceptually driven practice, seems really profoundly illuminating when we sort of think about economic structures and how they impact our production, to just think, well, we could be in a completely different system, and how would that look? Juan Gaitán approached the question of economics through very material manifestations of finance, namely banknotes and commodities, and he mobilized these through the specific economic realities of Canada and Brazil. And finally, I'm really excited to that we're able to present Candace Hopkins's talk here today. She will look at the Northwest Coast culture or tradition of the potluck. And I was really interested, this is, for example, one of those things that I felt had to be covered in the project, because the potluck is such a, did I say potluck? Yeah, it meant potlatch, sorry. I did have dinner, so. The potlatch, I think, has become such a myth in artistic production in recent years, and in particular in the so-called relational aesthetics kind of movement, if you can call it that, or the practices that are sort of categorized under that name, that I really felt it was important to kind of unwrap this whole thing again. And I think partially what's also led to this, to it becoming this idealized myth, is that the idea of the potlatch was really unmoored from its historical and cultural context. And Candace in his talk will do an interesting thing in kind of locating it again historically, but also I feel, really showing the relevance to today's practices. That's right, yeah. So just as an aside, actually, what this image is a picture of the Barter Theater in Abingdon, Virginia, the picture was taken approximately 1933, so during the Great Depression, and what they did was you brought in food items to attend the theatrical performances. So as I said, the Intangible Economies considers the relationship between affect and economy as an existential paradigm that is axiomatic to any society and, by extension, also represents the foundational source of creative production. The contributions to the project regard economy as a system in which what we call exchange is actually a dialectical operation that creates representation. As I have also mentioned as part of introducing Patricia Reed's contribution, the abstract and abstracting quality of value becomes a fulcrum in this constellation, both in its functional role in a capitalist economy and in its relevance to an ethics. Affect is to be recognized both as a generator and as a consequence of economic exchanges, as for example in the division of labor. This could be a very ideal type of division of labor that tends toward collaboration, or it could be the cold, hard Fordist kind of division of labor exemplified by assembly line production. At both ends of the spectrum, there is social interaction, though we might evaluate its quality differently. So while affect is generated through such economic exchanges, it is also precisely the modality of those exchanges that structure affect, resulting in the topographies of the sensible that underpin everyday life. So what does it mean to speak of economy? Etymologically, the term stems from the Greek oikonomia, translating into household management. And that breaks down again into oikos, house, and nomos, meaning law, regulation, or management. Only in modernity did economy begin to signify the wealth and resources of a country, that is, political economy. Meanwhile, the notion of a household already conjures much more than abstract fiscal transactions. It implies people living together under one roof. The term intangible reinforces an understanding of economy as made up of more than rational facts and figures. Nevertheless, the concept of the intangible has entered into the conventional teachings of economics and various other discourses such as law, where it variously describes such assets that cannot be physically measured, that literally cannot be touched. The word is used to describe, for example, such phenomena as employee morale, quality of life, and copyrights. The intention of intangible economies, however, is to focus on one particular intangible with regard to economy, that of affect. Affect, while a common enough term, describes in fact a difficult to grasp phenomenon that alternatively could be described as an intensity, resulting from sensory input. It is pre-symbolic and not yet culturally coded, and based in embodied experience. And hence what I mentioned earlier in terms of Melanie Gilligan's contribution that really sort of brought this to the fore. As I mentioned earlier in my example of the division of labor, economic activity frequently produces affective relationships, that is, relationships that evoke this intensity in their participating parties. Conversely, affect, and in particular desire, also generates economic transactions and can be considered a fundamental motor of any capitalist economy. It is the needing and wanting that demands to be satisfied by goods or immaterial values such as care, attention, or love. Focusing on the interconnected nature of affect and economy would be impossible without a consideration of the gift. Because as a transaction, the gift is explicitly bound up with affectivity. Marcel Mauss establishes that far from being an aberration of modern economies, the gift forms their very foundation. Reflecting on economic forms in the various societies on which he bases his empirical study for his seminal essay, The Gift, the Form and Reason for Exchange in Archaic Societies, Mauss states that, and I quote, "The market is a human phenomenon that, in our view, is not foreign to any known society, but whose system of exchange is different from ours. In these societies, we shall see the market as it existed before the institution of traders and before their main invention, money proper. We shall see how it functioned before the discovery of forms of contract and sale that may be said to be modern." End of quote. Just on the topic of money, here what you see is an example of emergency money from the city of Eltmann, and this is emergency money circulated quite broadly during the German inflation crisis in the 20s. And what happened there was that inflation was so rapid that the authorities could not issue money fast enough, which threatened to bring any kind of trading, even for basic goods, to a halt. So smaller cities, sometimes companies and so on, printed their own monies. And what really struck me about them, I put the translation of what it says on there underneath, was often they were artistically really quite sophisticated. Some carried poetry, some carried statistics and so on. So the notion of the banknote being, in a sense, also a handbill, and carrying information, not just being a stand-in for value, is very poignant there. So money, this most tangible aspect of an otherwise abstract system, functions like a commodity, but does so as a universal exchange equivalent, a floating signifier that is still expressive of the affective charge inherent in the gift. While the idea that a gift pays for something is somewhat of a taboo, it is understood that a gift can engender a kind of debt and thereby instantiate a social bond. Representative money, as in promissory notes that document a debt, and other currencies whose material value is less than their face value, like in paper money, or coins that are made of non-precious metals, emerged in Europe during the Dutch Golden Age, with its now famous crisis engendered by a craze for tulips. Money is peculiar in that it not only signifies by way of circulation, asserts value only through exchange, and as a stand-in for an abstract debt, we must trust that a dirty little bit of paper can be a placeholder for something that has use value, not just exchange value. This trust is by definition a social function, and in the case of paper money and coins made of base metals, it performs the miracle that alchemists long pursued in order to transform lead into gold. Parallel to personal debt being rendered abstract by the increasing pervasiveness of representative money in the early bourgeois society of 17th century Holland, a change in social hierarchies took place. Social position in that society now included a burgeoning middle class of affluent merchants, and thus became also based on wealth and possession and not just on bloodlines, as had previously been the case. The depersonalization of debt through the invention of representative money can therefore be considered as but one facet of a broader set of concerns during the 17th and 18th century that heralded the beginning of modernity in Europe. Meanwhile, the role that the gift may have played in the proto-economic social structures described by Mauss is also inflected by a notion of giftedness, an idea that in postmodern times has become problematic in its correlation to the gifted genius. Today, the presupposition that an artist must possess singular abilities is questionable, even though the art market thrives on this concept. The idea of the creative gift implies something supernatural, something that exceeds the artist's skill, forming a kind of transcendent element. The fact that the gift enables, the The fact that what the gift enables is not entirely of the artist's own making also constitutes a debt. However, in a secular society, this debt owed to an unknown or unspecified in a secular society, this debt is owed to an unknown or unspecified creditor. And I'm making reference here to sort of early practices, again in Europe, where you had craftspeople sort of expending their skill in the service of the church. So that's really where I think the transition from craftspeople to kind of artists distilled itself. So despite this creditor is unspecified, this debt nevertheless must be returned. The gift's product must be put into circulation. I suggest that an economy can be regarded as a system in which, through exchange, a type of dialectical operation enacts representation. Having earlier conjured the etymological roots of economy, the compound of oikos and nomos, it is tempting to assume that nomos, the word for law and regulation, also forms the etymological root for naming. However, the latter term derives from a different word, onomos. Nevertheless, this etymological confusion, conflating regulation and management with naming, remains compelling when considering economy as a system where an act of representation determines what can stand in for something else. So a cup of coffee costs $3. That's a kind of stand-in relationship. In linguistics, and by extension in naming, Ferdinand de Saussure has taught that this essentially arbitrary relationship between signifier and signified is only operative within a given system. In Saussure's teaching, this system is a language, a cultural construct that, to be called a system, must underlie somewhat consistent rules or customs. While the effect of signification is not a given and arises from its use and inaction, it is subject to constant, more or less subtle, change because signification has to be continually performed, and in every instance of an action, slight changes are able to occur. It is a system that exists only through the doing. This process of establishing signification is essentially one of trade. One could even say it involves a kind of bartering. So if I put forth a word and mean it to say X, my opposite may accept that word by using it in a slightly different context and thereby altering its meaning minutely. I could say, I pay you $5 for the sack of potatoes. You say, no, I'll take it for $3. And we agree on $4 in the process of it. So I'm overly simplifying it, but what I'm trying to emphasize is this back and forth movement between these, or in this process. The seemingly simple establishment of a good's value, that is, the establishment of what it can be represented by, involves material, land, and people. All of these elements must connect in complex ways, and the abstraction that is necessary for this operation to take place is at once at the base of any system of representation, and it is also integral to Marx's theory of alienation. The notion of alienation also already contains the idea embodied in the Hegelian Entäußerung, later mobilized by Marx to express workers expending or selling their labor, only to subsequently encounter it in the form of commodities. By highlighting abstraction, I may appear to be characterizing economy as a kind of inanimate, mechanized system. Yet quite to the contrary, if an economy is considered a system of exchange, it requires actors that perform this exchange. And while fundamental to human nature, its particular formation is man-made, and economic dynamics operate as an articulation of social structures that, in turn, are based on actual individual relationships. In his exploration of gift economies, Mauss identifies an important facet, namely the connection of the economy with the notion of, in his case, moral values. through its enactment of interpersonal relationships, once more emphasizing the aforementioned factor of performativity in representation. This type of representation may take the form of a script, as for a play, a film, or history, or it can take the form of a law or customs as an expression of an ethics founded on a set of values. Mauss highlights how, in what he calls archaic societies, economic activity is interwoven with the social through, and I quote again, contractual morality, namely how the law relating to things, even today, and today for him was also the 20s, remain linked to the law relating to persons. Mauss goes on to state that this morality and organization still function in our own societies in unchanging fashion and, so to speak, hidden below the surface. And as in this we have found one of the human foundations on which our societies are built, we shall be able to deduce a few moral conclusions concerning certain problems posed by the crisis in our law and economic organization. That's the end of quote. Mauss mentions a crisis, and indeed his essay, The Gift, was published, as I just mentioned, in 1923-24. Just a few years prior to the Great Depression and contemporaneously with the great inflation crisis in Germany. By definition, a crisis is a point at which previous assumptions that ensured the smooth operation of whatever system we might consider fail. It represents a rupture in the flow of things, not unlike that of a revolution, suggesting an interconnection between the precariousness of a crisis, the inherent revolutionary potential of such a crisis, and the libidinal force expressing the pursuit of an ideal that arises from this mix, forcing a reflection on what really matters existentially, and what is of essential value. When I think of crises in pictures, what I conjure are often images of accumulations of people. People in lineups, people in military formations, people huddled in shelters, or people protesting. These images perhaps come to mind most immediately because I recognize in them the strange power of physical proximity, of affectivity in large groups of people bound by a volatile energy that both fuels and seems to resist the drive of the crowd to represent itself, to articulate itself as a social body. Interestingly, recent movements such as Occupy have inaugurated new types of group engagement in the sense that they seem to employ very distinct modes of communication and discourse, as evidenced in for example, in the call and response format of public address, or the deliberate refusal to define clear, overarching demands that are otherwise considered fundamental to a productive public dialogue. And I think I've just before I came here, I was briefly in Canada, and it's quite interesting while the Occupy movement has sort of maybe drifted a little bit out of the public focus. In Canada right now, there's the Idle No More movement, has sort of just gathered momentum, which is driven by the First Nations communities, and they seem to have some similar kind of dynamics that also seem to be not so much about putting forth a position, but basically bringing issues to the fore and forcing a public dialogue and discussion that can be more or less antagonistic. In accepting the notion of an economy functioning as a system of representation at the intersection of picturing and representing interests, it also becomes recognizable as fundamental to the process of subject formation. The German word Entäußerung that I mentioned earlier offers a poignant clue to this idea because it not only translates into the English terms divestment, externalization, and alienation, but it also contains the German reflexive verb sich äußern, which means to speak out, to express oneself, to pronounce, or to manifest. This complex of meaning seems to illustrate the connection between cultural production, whether it be in writing, visual arts, or other disciplines. It also invokes a quality of becoming self through expression, that is, externalizing part of oneself, Lacan's entry into the symbolic order. The Slovenian philosopher Rado Riha stated, "Eine Idee ist ein Lebensakt." An idea is an act of living, an existential act, which is a significant statement in the context of this project. It is a project, after all, that trades in ideas expressed primarily through language, their most common vehicle. In its necessary abstraction, even the most basic linguistic articulation requires an act of faith, namely that the signifier is in fact transmitting the signified. The exchange of complex abstract ideas multiplies this miraculous transmission of the meaning to the nth power. Yet ideas can signify only in a dialectical matrix, an exchange, and they accrue value only in their circulation. And it is in this quality that they strangely resemble money. It is in the sometimes mind-boggling abstraction of ideas traded that points out their pivotal role in an economy of desire. The idea will always be more connective than the realization of that idea. Since it is an individually idealized construct, it is embedded in a desirous libidinal order. And ironically, it is precisely the misunderstandings on which a shared idea is inevitably based that make it so connective, so powerful as a social bond. Äußerung or Entäußerung marks the moment when a subject emerges, an entry into the symbolic order, into language, and by extension into a social matrix. At the same time, another kind of partaking in a social matrix gives rise to a much more material alienation through the Marxian alienation of labor, the expenditure of one's labor power. This alienation, this abstraction, marks a loss. Yet also connected to the work complex Äußerung, Entäußerung is the expression außer sich sein, to be beside oneself. This too describes a loss, the dialectical losing of oneself, being alienated from oneself, and at once becoming self-finding and finding oneself positioned. It describes the quintessential affective state, an unmediated intensity. It was Jacques Derrida's project in Given Time, One, Counterfeit Money, that established the notion of the gift that is so central to Mauss's project, and quite contrary to the sociologist's thesis, as extra-symbolic. For Derrida, any gift understood as such or intended as such by the donor or recipient ceases to deserve the designation of gift, something freely given without implied obligation of return. Hence, Derrida's gift defines itself as external to an economy of exchange, of tit for tat. It refuses the representation that is fundamental to the symbolic order. Derrida writes, "A gift that would neither give itself nor give itself as such, and that could not take place except on the condition of not taking place and of remaining impossible without dialectical sublation of the contradiction, to desire to think the impossible, to desire to give the impossible, this is obviously madness. The discourse that orders itself on this madness cannot let itself be contaminated by it." End of quote. For Derrida, a gift seems something truly lost, and the loss, rather than marking a privation, actually describes the entry into an entirely different order, the impossible. If economy is an articulation of a social matrix and vice versa, one might ask whether this is a closed circuit, one always mapping the other, caught in an entropic system. Yet it's easy to see how affect, and in particular desire, can, as a disruptive force in this constellation, produce a change or, innovation, the latter being a marketable form of the former, if it is possible to make a loss the way Derrida describes, if it is possible, sich zu veräußern, to be beside oneself, moved by an affective force, then Derrida's gift marks a bridge between an ideal and material reality, an impossible condition where the ideal is not rendered obsolete by its attempted realization. It would be both naive and ignorant to position cultural production as generative of this gift, but it is perhaps the indeterminacy in relation to both where and what kind of value can arise in cultural production that gives it agency and that opens up a space for the impossible. Thank you. So we now, if you need clarification immediately, speak up. Otherwise, I would say we'll talk later. But otherwise, yeah. Next up is Candace Hopkins with her presentation.
Thanks. Just this. Perfect. Can everyone hear? Great. I just wanted to say thank you to Antonia and Richard for inviting me here to speak with you, as well as to Philip. My slides already started. Don't worry. There we go. As well as to Philip, Richard and Jenny at Artist Space. So just to give a brief introduction, when Antonia and I first spoke about my contribution to Philip, first of all, I think we were both interested in if there were other ways of addressing the potlatch. For one, it's a tradition that exists today, still exists, is practiced by some of my ancestors in the Yukon, Tlingit people, as well as many other indigenous people. But it's also a practice that's been highly appropriated, not just more recently, but also within French theory. The Situationists, for example, used to have a magazine that was called The Potlatch. And so we thought it was an opportune moment to rethink this moment. And for me, it was an opportunity to do some more deep research. And so that's why there's these historical images behind me. So the title of my presentation is The Golden Potlatch, a study in mimesis and capitalist desire. And the presentation really tries to tie three different things. The Klondike Gold Rush that happened in the Yukon in the late 1800s, as well as the Golden Potlatch, which took place in Seattle in the early 1900s, and then the practice of the potlatch, which still exists today. So I'll begin. The docking of the two steamships, the Excelsior and the Discovery, that were filled to the brim with gold mined from Canada's Yukon Territory and now rich prospectors, was perhaps the single most significant event to take place in Seattle during the late 1800s. And behind me are images of the arrivals of those ships. For one, it immediately boosted the economies of the city as well as the country. It also brought the intricate relationships between belief, and in this case what I mean by belief is the potential for economic prosperity, and it's something to keep in mind because it plays an important role within all of this, as well as capitalist desire and wealth into public consciousness. So the Excelsior arrived in Seattle's harbor on July 15th, 1897, and it caused something of a media frenzy. There's another view of the docking. So photos of individuals who are hauling sacks and suitcases off the ship. In some cases, they had so much gold that they needed other people to help them. Quickly circulated. There you go. But really, it was the arrival of a ship that came 2 days later, the ship called the Discovery, that contained even more gold, over 2 tons of gold, that initiated the single largest collective expedition for gold in North America's history, called the Klondike Gold Rush. It promised riches for anyone who is willing to undertake the journey north, and there's estimated between 40 to 100,000 people who, mostly from the United States, who abandoned their previous lives to become prospectors, suppliers, showgirls, and numerous other vernacular vocations in an environment that for most people was utterly foreign to them. And the gold rush had its most immediate impact in Seattle, and documents from the period report that the city basically emptied out overnight. And the mayor was also caught in the craze. He was out of town during the ship's docking, but he sent his letter of resignation from afar to immediately join the throngs of people who were heading north. And differing from previous gold rushes in the US, those struck by the potential for gold in Canada's north were not only from North America, but also from Europe, as well as from Asia, among other places. And this was an anomaly that I think points to the fact that the desire for the metal was also present throughout a number of countries in Europe, possibly because of their recent adoption of the gold standard. And while the rush seemingly took place overnight, prospectors had searched for and had found gold in the Yukon for nearly a quarter of a century prior to the big strike. But a lot of these reports never really made the front page of major newspapers, and they were largely ignored. And because of the harsh climate of the Yukon and Alaska, the Klondike presented far more personal risk than any of the other previous gold rushes. This was an image that I found that I particularly liked. It's a Klondike manual for gold seekers that's published out of New York. I'm not certain that New Yorkers really had a sense of what the Klondike was like. So here's a view of the Chilkoot Pass. So to give you some sense of how gold was extracted, in the beginning, nearly all of the gold that made it out of the Yukon was recovered by hand. Prospectors removed the frozen earth, and then they waited for warmer weather, and then they would waited for warmer weather for the earth to melt, and then they ran the earth through a system of wooden troughs of slurry. And gold, being a relatively heavy metal, would fall to the bottom. And the process was mechanized only at the decline of the rush. And this was a development that's quite interestingly related to the Guggenheim family, these Guggenheims, and they played a major role, and they still play a major role in gold prospecting now. So many potential prospectors never made it beyond the first leg of what could only be considered a ridiculously grueling journey across the Chilkoot Pass, and it was one of the only ways to reach the mineral-rich Yukon. So to give you a sense of a detailed description of what they're doing here, the Northwest Mounted Police were stationed at the summit of both the Chilkoot and the White Pass to ensure that every stampeder was adequately outfitted to survive 1 year in the Klondike. And adequate means, per person, 1 ton of goods. So this included food, tents, cooking utensils, tools, and the stampeders walked 80 miles for every single mile that they moved their provisions. So they had to take many, many trips up this pass in order to get the 1 ton of goods up there. And the worst part of the trail, and this is what you see behind you, was called the Golden Stairs. And those were 1,500 steps carved out of mountain ice. So they moved up the stairs in a single line, clutching the rope balustrade, carrying their goods on their backs 50 to 60 pounds at a time, and they also hired local indigenous people to help with this. And what I thought was interesting is that you can't really use the term stampede in such crowded, slow-moving conditions. It was more like a crawl. And a single trip up the Golden Stairs took about 6 hours. There's another view of what people are hauling. So the docking of those 2 ships, the Discovery and the Excelsior, arrived at a fortuitous moment. They docked following a period of severe economic depression in the US, the worst seen to date. So the first depression began earlier. It was called the Panic of 1873, and it was It was started by an overinvestment in railroads, so a single economy and also an economy with very slow returns, as well as the switch from bimetallism to a monometallic de facto gold standard. And this was brought about by the introduction of the United States Coinage Act of 1873. So with this new monetary system, the standard economic unit was based on the fixed rate of gold. So this overemphasis on a single metal, which people took quite literally, the adoption of the gold standard, resulted almost immediately in its being perceived as scarce. The perception was somewhat justified, being that the rate of economic expansion was actually capped by the amount of gold that was held in US reserves. And the speed at which many European countries had also adapted to the gold standard further contributed to the crisis, a crisis that in many ways was largely imagined. Between 1873 and 1897, for example, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Switzerland, France, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Spain, Finland, and the Austrian Empire made the switch. And this is actually following Britain, who Canada followed at that time and adopted the gold standard much earlier, and that was in 1853. So the belief in the scarcity of gold had the result of rapidly increasing its value. And this, combined with a kind of feverish demand, had a deep effect on US citizens. So gold was quickly hoarded, and this is citing Pierre Burton from his book, The Klondike, in socks, sugar bowls, and under floorboards and in personal safes. Savings were withdrawn from banks, causing bank runs and a series of bank failures, which were economically devastating as well. The number of gold coins and gold certificates in active circulation were also reduced. And by 1892, only 190 million in gold coin and gold certificates out of a total of 730 million remained in the US Treasury. So recognizing this as a state of emergency, then President Cleveland borrowed 65 million in gold from JP Morgan and Associates, a Wall Street bank, to shore up reserves in the US Treasury. And this at the time was unprecedented. An estimated 15,000 companies and 500 banks failed, many in the western US. And at its peak, between 17 and 19% of people were unemployed. And then this slump morphed into outright panic in 1893 when foreign governments lost their faith that the US could maintain their payments in gold. So in many ways, when the two ships docked, loaded with metal, 2 tons, and that was just the discovery, the event immediately took on near mythical dimensions. So images and stories of the public spectacle that surrounded the moment were widely circulated in news media, and it provided the very boost that the economy needed. The event was read locally and abroad as a sign of the US's newfound economic prosperity. There are some other views of the provisions that people were taking up the Golden Staircase. So while the Klondike is in Canada, the region borders Alaska, and most of the gold that was tapped was actually brought to markets in the US, not in Canada. And in a large part, I think, because the US had already gone through previous gold rushes and was more equipped to handle the rush of gold. So for me, I think it was arguably the very belief in economic prosperity, just seeing the signs of the two ships docking and seeing the bags filled of gold, and that were circulated as signs, the images of the ships, rather than the influx of any real money that had the most impact on transforming the US economy. So the author, Pierre Burton, describes one of many examples of this rapid transformation, and I quote, "In the first 2 weeks of the gold rush, telegraph orders on the Puget Sound National Bank, which was headquartered in Seattle, increased 5-fold over any other period in the bank's history, while the sale of bank drafts tripled and express business doubled, and by August, the city's total business had leaped by 50%. So this is really before the influx of any real money. It's just the belief that the economy was changing. And the focus on gold had other unanticipated effects, one of which was that people began seeing it everywhere. And I'll quote this at length because it's particularly good, and this is from Pierre Burton's book as well. So, a group of Italian laborers in New York City saw gold in some sand in which they were digging and began to talk to newspapermen of fortune. A visitor to Victoria saw gold in an outcropping in a gutter near the city's post office and tried to stake a claim on the main street. Gold started to turn up in almost every state of the Union. Trinity County, California went wild over the alleged discovery of some old Spanish mines. A report from Michigan claimed that the town was sitting upon a vein that was of gold that was 40 feet wide. Peru tried to revive the gold mines of the Incas. Deadwood announced the discovery of a new gold vein. The old Caribou and Kootenai regions of British Columbia began to report new gold finds. Mexico claimed that there was gold in Yaqui country. Russia insisted that there are fabulous mines just across from Alaska, and even China talked about new discoveries. So it wasn't just local, but international. So I also wanted to point out that at that time, there was no consensus between newcomers and local indigenous people in the Yukon regarding the value of gold when the Klondike Gold Rush first started. Although gold was highly valued among many native societies throughout the Americas as both a material and a resource, it had no existing function or value for Tagish and Tlingit people. In Mesoamerica, for example, gold was the preferred metal to create effigies of God, and Indian people from the Andes considered God as coming directly from the heavens. Gold for them was literally sun shit. However, once the opportunity to trade the resource arose within the microeconomies of the Klondike Gold Rush, it was quickly brought into circulation among local indigenous people. So prospectors came in search of a material whose value was accrued only at a distance. Once removed from the local lands and brought to markets in the US and Canada and also abroad in Europe. But prospectors weren't the only ones looking to capitalize, of course. Indigenous people had already been trading with Russians and Spaniards and British for nearly 100 years, and with other indigenous tribes since time immemorial. They saw the situation and shrewdly took it for what it was, and that was an economic opportunity. The Chilkat charged exorbitant fees to any unwitting prospector looking to cross their territory and to enter the Yukon, and for many years, in fact, they staved off prospectors who were looking to get into the gold-rich Klondike area leading up to the big strike. And those heading with their supplies over the Chilkoot and the White Passes, and those were the two main routes to get into the gold fields, had to rely on the high price services of both Tagish and Tlingit men, often the only people who were physically capable of carrying the prospectors' heavy supplies. And there were also a number of instances during the Klondike Gold Rush when the value of the resources, such as pack dogs and sled dogs, chickens, eggs, and sewing machines, as well as alcohol and entertainment, so commodities or those things that had an immediate use value, far outweighed what could be traded for the gold tapped from the ground. I thought that this was a particularly inventive image. You can see that they're using sails and the boats actually have skis on them to get across the lake. So this, in times, led to what could be called a currency famine, something that Antonia was speaking about. So what happened in this moment, I think, like many other currency famines, was there were a number of creative monetary substitutes, including due bills from manufacturers, certified checks, certificates of deposit, and cashier's checks in small amounts, so things that could be used to replace real money. And due to the scarcity of currency, it was sold in shops often for 2% over its face value. And sub-large companies actually made plans to issue a currency of their own that would be redeemable when the banks resumed cash payments. That area there is just below where the city of Whitehorse now sits, and it's called 5 Mile Rapids. So as I mentioned before, gold attained its real market value only outside of its local context, and much of the Klondike's economic impact asserted itself, in fact, outside of the Yukon Territory. Canada was not in a position to benefit economically from its own resources, as the US had already experienced other gold rushes. And it was also accentuated by geographic conditions. The most direct route to get the gold out of the Yukon was, in fact, to go through Alaska, and then down on ships through the Alaska Panhandle that were destined for US ports. And once at those ports, the gold was weighed, processed, and then sold to enter distant global markets. So unlike the beginnings of other US gold rushes, early rumors, some beginning 25 years prior, as well as published reports on the Yukon's burgeoning mineral wealth initially had little impact in the South. And this made the ship's arrival that much more of a sensation. It was as though a situation of extreme economic desperation had conjured its own miraculous cure. With the events surrounding the Klondike Gold Rush, the link between desire and economic prosperity was also made clear. Economic prosperity, I think, being the very motor of capitalist desire and vice versa. And I think what this moment also points to is the relationship and the degree to which magic, belief, and luck remains tied to systems of economic exchange, even now, and I think ultimately to the accumulation of capital. Marcel Mauss describes the very origins of economic values as religious in nature. Economic activities, in his view, and I'm quoting him, retain a ceremonial character, one that is obligatory and effective. No matter how distant we are from our collective origins and systems of mutual reciprocity and exchange, I think that these values remain full of rites and rituals. In many ways, then, money still possesses its magical power. It is this understanding of magical power, ritual, and ceremony attached to systems of exchange that bring me to discussing what was called the golden potlatch. It was a moment when 4 prominent businessmen living in Seattle drew upon when they invented what they called the golden potlatch. It was a citywide festival that rather artfully, even though they weren't artists, they were admin, combined, that doesn't mean that admin aren't artistic, artfully combined the just past prosperity of the Klondike Gold Rush with the mutual reciprocity operating at the heart of the potlatch ceremony that remains customary among certain Native North American societies. This is a view actually of Dawson City when it was formed as a result of the gold rush in the Yukon. And here are the 4 admin, non-native admin in their Tlingit attire. So following its first iteration in 1911, the golden potlatch took place annually for 3 years. It was briefly resuscitated between 1935 and 1941 and continues today, in fact, in a much different form and is known as the Seafair celebrations. Central to the festival was an elaborate performance of, I think, borrowing the term from Michael Tausig's sympathetic magic, which included a reenactment of the docking of the Discovery. That was the second ship that docked that was filled with gold, complete with a small-scale replica of the original ship. As you'll see, the people who were organizing the parade and the Golden Potlatch Festival really, they went all out. So they combined the optimism and promise of wealth associated with the gold rush, along with the communal gift-giving and redistribution of wealth that's characteristic to potlatch ceremonies then and now. I think what was interesting for me about this moment as well, that they were probably ignorant of the fact that potlatch ceremonies both in the US and Canada were illegal at the time for Native people. And this ban was rigorously enforced by both missionaries and in Canada by Indian agents as part of assimilationist policies in both countries. And I wanted to read a little bit here. So the potlatch ban in Canada was only repealed in 1951. In the US, possibly because it was less of a threat, because there were less groups of Indigenous people practicing it, it was dropped in 1934. During the ban, when ceremonies weren't forced to a halt altogether, they moved underground. So they continued in some communities in a more subdued form so that they wouldn't attract the attention of overzealous missionaries or Indian agents. And it was the opinion of missionaries and Indian agents at that time that the potlatch, which was the very backbone of many Northwest Coast Native societies, was, and I quote them from that time, a worse than useless custom. They vehemently regarded it as, and I quote them again, wasteful, unproductive, and contrary to civilized values. So it was curious to me then that this public emergence in the early 1900s of a bastardized form of the golden potlatch would take place. So to give you a sense of the relationship between both the ad men and traditional Tlingit people, I wanted to contrast the two images. There's a reenactment, or their remaking of the ship, the Discovery. And there's a view of the parade. I just want to show you one quick image here. Okay. So official invitations to the 1911 event circulated in the form of beautifully typeset postcards. And as well, in one of them, there was a particularly compelling example. It included an image of what I would say, quote unquote, sea-wash Indian wear sellers that were flanked by portraits of Chief Seattle and Princess Angeline, who are real people, of course. The tagline promised a hot time in a cool place. So there's another one. So the 1912 edition of the Golden Potlatch Parade was more elaborate. It included 250 plaster-scale replicas of existing totem poles, and they were erected throughout the city, along with other public ceremonial markers. Major events included a large parade down Main Street, as well as plays, public initiations, and this was quite interesting to me. So the ad men, and I'm sure people who are working with the ad men, took on these, what they called public initiations, which had the purpose of quite literally infecting the public, and that's their word, infecting, with the festival spirit. And it also included a daily media blitz that had press releases that contained poetry, news, songs, and images which further promoted the event. There's another official invitation. The parade, for them, was an unabashed advertising gesture. It was intended to boost the city's economy, and it was also a form of social narration. There's one of the totem poles. Okay, here was the invitation that I was talking about, the hot time in a cool place. Okay, here's an image of one of the parades. Okay, I'm just going to find my place here. Okay, so the parade, which was an unabashed advertising gesture that was intended to boost the city's economy, is a kind of social narration. It's a demonstration through public spectacle. It's a kind of demonstration of power or narrative. Parades assist in solidifying connections with their audiences. As a form of tableau, they rely on an elaborate symbolism that tells spectators a particular story about society as they pass by. So the story, I think, that the Golden Potlatch Parade was trying to tell was one of organized optimism, and optimism related to economy. Those are rabbits. So during the parades, I found images where different ethnic groups were displayed and celebrated through dedicated floats. One image showed a float that carried a large banner reading Afro-Americans. And with this, I also wanted to point out that the celebration of different race and class, in fact, mirrors the permutations between assumed hierarchies and divisions between race, class, and gender that took place during the Klondike and previous gold rushes. This was perhaps one of the only instances during that time when cross-dressing was not only tolerated but encouraged. Calamity Jane is one example, but the singular focus on one resource and the nearly irreducible power attributed to whoever had it in their possession brought forth intriguing instances of hierarchies being challenged or even flipped on their heads. Relationships and business partnerships between people of different races and different classes, considered unacceptable, were then normalized during the gold rush, as were partnerships and even marriages between the very rich and the formerly very poor. The existence of gold radically leveled the playing field, so everyone, regardless of their background, had the potential to strike it rich, and this potential trumped nearly all former divisions. Here's another float, I think, dedicated to moose. So along with floats that were dedicated to different people, there were also, they also celebrated technical advancements such as transportation, car culture, local clubs including the Rotary, and westward expansion and settlement were promoted through a float that was dedicated to the first cabin. And for me, I think that was presumably the home of the first settler in the region. While parades commemorate history in the present moment, the golden potlatch also conjured a very specific idea of the future, one linked to economic prosperity and to the will for collective for wealth to be redistributed, and this was offered by the purposeful borrowing from the idea of the potlatch. There's the Rotary float. And this is, in fact, a float that's dedicated to the docking of the ship, so I'll get into this a little bit more. So unlike traditional potlatch ceremonies, in the festivities that were associated with the golden potlatch in Seattle, no goods, materials, or other tokens were gifted or exchanged. So in customary potlatch ceremonies, goods in the form of material as well as non-material wealth, and mainly also non-material wealth, are generally given with the intention that they be paid back at a future date with interest. So potlatches, each with very specific associations and intentions depending on the specific indigenous culture that they emerge from, are one way in which Native societies honor ancestors. It's also a way to give names, to repay debts, to share resources, to settle disputes. So it's a way of settling disputes so you don't go into situations of war, as well as to instill social values. Peter Lamborn Wilson puts forth that spiritual anarchy arising from the willful appropriation of Native traditions and belief is in fact America's oldest heritage. Relative to the golden potlatch, this perhaps points to both a desire for economic prosperity along with the obligatory and ceremonial sharing of wealth. An invention of 4 of the country's earliest advertising men, the people who you saw pictured at the very beginning in Tlingit regalia, and they're actually not named in text. I searched and searched, but I couldn't find their names. But I know that they're from the ranks of Seattle's biggest downtown promoters, including the Chamber of Commerce, as well as both major newspapers, the Post-Intelligencer, as well as the Seattle Times, and the brand new Seattle Advertising Club. So the Golden Potlatch was a self-declared advertising stunt. And the origins of the festival, and this is their words, are described as follows. The organizers explained that they had borrowed the term potlatch from the quaint jargon of the Chinook, which means a carnival of sports, music, dancing, and feasting, and the distributing of gifts by hosts to all guests. They developed an extended Indian fantasy to suggest the exotic and mysterious character of the potlatch. And they had a name for themselves. They called themselves the Tillicums of Iltais, and they formed a local secret order. And the narrative that shaped the Potlatch Festival was that the highest T, the chief of the North, paddled to Seattle to visit his white brethren in the South, perhaps ignorant of the fact that there's also indigenous people in the South. He was attended by leaders of 5 Alaskan tribes, each represented by a contrived totem. So the highest Tai, the Grand Chief, shared his knowledge of the picturesque and romantic Indian North with potlatch visitors. And in return, the city of Seattle offered him access to, and I quote, the ways of modernity. The specific ceremony that the Golden Potlatch is conjuring remains integral to Tlingit society in Alaska and in the Yukon, and it's still practiced today. It's called the Ku'eks, and it's a memorial ceremony, and it's the one that most closely resembles the potlatch. So keep in mind that even the term potlatch is sort of an overarching term for many very, very different ceremonies, but all have the main characteristic of redistributing wealth. So it's central to both the healing and the spiritual dimensions of Tlingit societies, and it commemorates the recently deceased. During the event, as it's practiced now, usually a hall or community gathering space is stacked with foods and other material goods that range from things like, depending on the time of year, berries and apples, oranges, bread, candy, pop, juice, to blankets, as well as other special gifts that are meant to be given to certain individuals. There's also a group of very sacred objects that are called the atto, and they're not displayed publicly, but they're instead kept in decorated chests and they're out of sight until they're actively used as part of the ceremony. And this includes robes which were worn at the start of the ceremony, as well as other things. So the most highly valued objects in Tlingit society are considered actually masterless or ownerless things. And clans collectively act as their stewards in perpetuity. So actual money has also entered into this tradition through the ceremonial realm, through its integration into this ceremony. So small amounts, $1 or $2, perhaps now a little bit more, are exchanged as a symbolic gesture of support rather than a display of what you could call competitive wealth. And they're given discreetly to friends and to relatives of the opposite moiety. And a moiety is one of two kinship groups that make up a specific community. And the names of those who have given small amounts of money are later publicly acknowledged. So I think it's important to also note this and to go into a little bit of detail about the ceremony now. And so the hosts begin the ceremony with what they call a cry section, where they sing one of 4 mourning songs. And then this is followed by what's known in English as the widow's cry. And it's a song that's performed by the opposite moiety, and those are the guests. And the purpose of these songs for the guests is to remove the grief of the hosts. So central to the understanding of the ceremony is what's called a widow's cry. And for some people, they consider that it might be confusing to people outside of Tlingit society, because the removal of the grief is directed not towards the surviving spouse of someone who's recently died, but to actually the guest's relations, but to the survivor's clan towards the clan of the departed. The speeches are directed not primarily or exclusively to the widow, but by relatives of her family and the clan of the deceased. This is not to minimize the grief of the widow or the widower, after whom this part of the ceremony is named, but in fact to maximize the consolation offered across these two kinship lines. I'll leave it there for a minute. So the ceremony in many ways is an example of the complex relationships between balance and reciprocity that are central to Tlingit society. And these relationships form what could be called the underlying philosophy of Tlingit tradition and social structure. So when given and received, this wealth through a potlatch, both material and otherwise, is weighted with contractual obligations. For Marcel Mauss, this relationship that one enters into, which he calls contractual, in a potlatch is in fact legally binding. Through what he terms total social phenomena, all kinds of institutions are given expression at one and the same time, religious, legal, and moral, and they relate to both politics and the family. Likewise, economic ones, which suppose special forms of production and consumption, of performing total services and of distribution. So this ceremony within Tlingit society now is perhaps a permanent form of contractual morality brought about through what Marx would call total social phenomena, where the necessity for healing generates an economic act. So it's this ceremony that's emptied of all its spiritual dimensions and cultural context from which the golden potlatch liberally borrows. And through this form of sympathetic magic, being an act of mimicry performed to bring about the thing that's being copied, social and economic value systems of both native and European societies were merged to create a new kind of hybrid event. And it was discovered in this hope that this act of, it was produced in the hope that this act of mimesis, not unlike the sensational arrival of those two ships, the Excelsior and the Discovery, would once more conjure a moment of economic optimism. So capitalist desire and prosperity were emphatically linked through the metaphor of sickness. And here to emphasize that again is an image of the potlatch bug. And it's an intriguing parallel to the healing dimensions of the kuex, as this was the very thing that was mobilized in this narrative. So in a moment of what I would consider to be genius marketing, the men behind the golden potlatch created the perfect mascot for their event, and it was called the potlatch bug. It emerged in 1912 during the second iteration of the summer festival as the event's emblem and a highly recognizable brand. So it was represented in a style typical of the aesthetics of Northwest Coast native art, with its face painted in red and white and with black form lines. And the bug was more human-like than insect-like. It had a decorated crest on its forehead, as you can see behind me, kohl-rimmed eyes and claw-tipped fingers. And the bug's primary characteristic was its infectious grin. And I'm nearly done for those people who are getting anxious for a bathroom break. Through their marketing campaign, the organizers pointed to an intriguing link between the desire for economic prosperity and illness. So the purpose of their mascot was to inoculate you, and again, these are their words, to inoculate you with carnival spirit. And they even created what they called a bug high priest. So in this figure, which merged faith with the organizers' understandings of the potlatch, they inserted a hypothetical virus within Seattle's populace. And there was a word for this virus, and let me get it right, enthusiasmatus. And the initiation into what they called the Golden Potlatch Club included a mock injection of the sacred virus of the great bug. With what one can imagine was a combination of religious zeal and the focus of ritual, the injection was administered by an ad club member who attended the meeting in full regalia. And so Pierre Burton, the author, similarly describes the effect of the Klondike Gold Rush as a malady, as a kind of sickness. In his words, so infectious was the Klondike epidemic, and he calls it an epidemic as well, that the flimsiest rumor served to send hundreds dashing to the farthest corners of the northern hemisphere. So the golden potlatch, with its performative rhetoric of sickness associated with capitalist desire, enacts the symptoms of colonialism, while at the same time constituting a public acknowledgement of its existence. In this instance, perhaps revealing a need, if a need that's very deeply buried by the colonial actors for the true spirit and intent of the kuex, that is the Tlingit potlatch, that is to be healed. So the golden potlatch and the kuex each manifest different economic acts. Those producing the golden potlatch clearly saw the link between economic prosperity and collective belief, and by rightly understanding that the very belief in potential wealth can transform economies. Within the kuex, the production and the distribution of wealth ensures the health of the community, and it also ensures that societal values and obligations are upheld in perpetuity. So I think of further use, and this is my conclusion, to this understanding of the grand gesture of appropriation that's central to the golden potlatch, is the notion of Orientalism by Said, who succinctly describes it as a set of relationships marked by an imbalance of power that is the crossing point of divergent needs. So Orientalism, in its central operation, is characterized by a dominant narrator who idealizes a perceivably passive subject. There we go. To produce images that illustrate or embody possibilities that the dominant narrator desires but cannot tolerate in itself. And I think just to remind you again, at that time that potlatches were banned in both the US and Canada. These desires, which I would qualify were to be healed for economic prosperity and the communal distribution of wealth, were at play in the creation of the golden potlatch. Another central aspect to this event, which takes the possibilities presented by the embodiment of the other further still, relies on the relationships between mimesis, alterity, and sympathetic magic. For Walter Benjamin, the mimetic faculty represents not only the desire to illustrate or embody characteristics desired from the other, but is born of the very compulsion to become the other. So this mimesis that was brought by the golden potlatch was decidedly imperfect. I think from the outset it was not intended to create a perfect copy, but instead borrow from the idea of the potlatch for different objectives. The festival was the public performance of a larger narrative about economic prosperity. It was a form of what could be called mimetic excess framed by individual desire for wealth and power, made possible by the conjuring of modern-day capitalism. And perhaps to fully enter modernity, it was necessary for the city of Seattle to perform this mimesis, to experience the freedom to live reality as really made up. It was in that moment of creative freedom and quite liberal bastardization of other and economic values, fueled by very generalized understandings of the potlatch, that the golden potlatch achieved some of Marcel Maus's propositions for hybridized economies put forward in his conclusion to his book, The Gift. So in his words, these concepts of law and economies that it pleases us to contrast, liberty and obligation, liberty, liberally, generosity and luxury as against savings, interest, and utility, it would be good to put them in a melting pot once more. So he argues for the re-recognition of the value of reciprocity and exchange, something that for him forms the very basis of social life and by extension, social values. Thank you.
Thank you, Candice. So we're now going to have a 10-15-minute break. There is some food, some pizza out the front to sustain you for the next part of the evening, which will be Patricia's presentation. Thank you.
Of our imagination. How does a way of doing become valued as a good? And how does this valued good gain currency in the sphere of cohabitation? So there are several ways, what I would call moralistic misconceptions of what a good is. So it's kind of helpful to map out what a good is not and why. A good or a good life is often thought of as a device of social cohesion. The concept of a good identifies a particular people or culture to a life world of possible behaviors. These acceptable behaviors underlie modes of being and governance in accordance with a specific understanding of what a world is in the first place. With this dominant conception, a good functions as a force of social normalization. It casts limits that organize our orders of exchange and behavior in a particular way. A good, understood in this way, becomes the good as it draws out a finite perimeter of possible modes of inclusion within a given normal order. The good operates as a uniform gravitational force to which we revolve, becoming part of our everyday common sense. One could even go so far as to claim that the entire history of human civilization has been an experiment in defining and popularizing varying conceptions of this evasive good. The good, in this sense, is deployed as a stabilizing device, the definition of which operates as an unwritten bond uniting particular populations. So subsequent to the partitioning of the world into nation-state territories, this good has largely been defined and contained under the command of those various states, what we call nationalities. The definition of the good ushers in systems of belief, action, modes of dwelling, and ultimately marks out forms over life, outlining modes of inclusion within a given system of order. Now this is in contrast to forms of life, an important difference. For forms over life impose a limit of possible belonging to a given sphere, whereas forms of life are immanently limitless, activating other modes of belonging to a world. Understood in this way, the good is rendered as a property specific to a particular identity of peoples. In this example, the good is a property of the state, and all those who wish to be members are compelled to perform and identify with this property. The good is not a thing, not a good in the sense of a product. It has dramatic material consequences, as we witnessed in the bloody battles fought over its utter signification. So you just think of the winning of hearts and minds in the Iraqi insurgency, for example. In the current state of affairs, where battles are waged less in the hope of gaining physical territory, but more in relation to the occupation of cognitive territory, this is called new politics, NOO, The fight is precisely over the semantic territorialization of the good. When the good is deployed as a property that one must perform for ritual membership, the good becomes an imperative and therefore enters the category of the moral or unquestionable finite good. In taking on the quality of a moral command, the good bounds the very possibility of life itself, so forms over life, to the negation of potential and limitless forms of life. So there are two key points to note in our description of the good. The first is to note that the good is used as an apparatus for the normalization of relations. And second, that the good is deployed as an imperative. In the first instance, the good becomes synonymous with virtue, what the political philosopher Bonnie Honig critiques as a virtue theory of politics. The virtue theory of politics seeks to reconcile social dissonance and create systems of closure through administrative or juridical settlement. So reason and rationality are kind of core to her theory. In her theory, Honig contrasts virtue politics with virtu politics, a term she borrows from Nietzsche, where virtu is a politics of perpetual contest and augmentation. For Nietzsche, virtu is an ethical position that disrupts stabilized order through the activation of remainders of the system. In somewhat economic terms, virtu is the expression of a surplus of all that is excluded, concealed, or denied in the perimeter of a system of virtue. So there's quite a deep resonance between Nietzsche's expression of a surplus as an ethical position and Jacques Rancière's politics, a politics that stands in opposition to the social. Rancière equates the social with the police, so not to be confused with those men and women in uniform enacting authority. The police or the social is not negatively conceived, but can be defined as the hegemonic condition that describes bodies, roles, functions, places, and ways of doing a particular configuration within an established community. And most importantly, that this can be internalized or sensed by its members. The social is equated with the proper partitioning of the sensible world, to use Rancière's quite famous expression by now. The social can be thought of as the performance of a consensus, the performance of modes of being and appearing that are in accordance with their appropriate function, place, speech act, and identity. This performance marks an understanding of the partitioning of the sensible. Now, politics, on the other hand, for Rancière, is the contestation relative to the very formation of a space in common, and what makes common sense. Of the quote, part with no part, end quote. The surplus community, function, role, place, identity, and so on, unaccounted for within a given symbolic order. The part with no part is that which does not yet count. It's a potential party. It's not merely a dispute between parties. It is the constitution of a party as being a part. Politics as such is the clash of sense and sense, what he calls dissensus. The struggle between the partitioning of the sensible, so the normalized social world, and the ways of making sense of it. So with these contrasts in mind, we can say that when the good is deployed as a normalizing force, it is apolitical. It is the good upholding the habitual symbolic order of the social. And to reiterate, this is not necessarily negative, simply normative. The social good imposes an economy of scarcity of other possible worlds, as it is reinforced by the repetition of its consensual performance played out in daily rituals. The good, portrayed as a social entity according to which relations of consensus play out to and in the world, is a form over life, a sign that delineates a proper place, function, and behavior of members who are accounted for to the exclusion of any possible extraordinary condition. The second aspect of the good, and not a good, to be addressed, in tandem with its normalizing force, Is the notion of the good defined as an imperative? Are there ethical principles at work in the deployment of an imperative? And if so, what becomes of subjectivity when the good is figured as an obligatory undertaking? As Alain Badiou has said, there are no ethics in general, but only the capacity of humanity to recognize a good in particular situations. A good is, above all, a situated good, and not the general good. To generalize good as an imperative falls under the rubric of morality as outlined by Foucault, when he defines morality as, quote, a prescriptive code one is obliged to follow, end quote. When the good is used to normalize the social via commandment to obey its force as virtue, it is the moral good, the social good, and not a political good. So, what is the political good? Although he's mistrustful of ethics in politics, Rancière recalls that before ethics signifies moral norms, it signifies, quote, both the dwelling and the way of being that corresponds to this dwelling, end quote. What is of key importance here is that before ethics would imply a law one is obliged to follow, it signifies the inaction of dwelling, of living itself. And if ethics is a mode of being in relation to an environment, then it is an action subject to forces of will and motivation. In taking on the question of motivational force in regards to the census, Simon Critchley looks to ethics as a metapolitical moment that provides, quote, propulsion into political action, end quote. A good, for Critchley, is a concept that is subjectively perceived as a demand to which a self binds itself in approval. When the self adheres in fidelity to this perceived demand of a good, a system of ethics ensues. A good, as a subjectively identified sense, is the capacity for imagination acted upon. That capacity of imagination for what could be against an environment and forms over life that already are. So it's here worthwhile to note Badiou's very concise definition of consensus, which is the merging of what is with what could be. So what could be is definitively linked to dissensus, to the articulation of the part within a part. For Badiou, the capacity to imagine a good is in fact what good gives humans their humanity, is what gives humankind immortality, a humanity beyond the biological finitude of human existence, liberating it from the victimizing fate of certain organic death. As a result, to reject the possibility of imagining a good, to submit humankind to a regime of morals without ethics, is to deprive humankind of its very humanity. For Critchley, the perception of a good is manifest in the figuration of the other. This perception is equal to the capacity of perceiving what the other is demanding. And because the demand is immeasurable, it can never be fulfilled. So just to be clear, I'm going to be using the word other in a super general way, no psychoanalytic other. It's simply that which is heterogeneous or altered to what is, so it could be a person, place, speech, act, situation, and so on. The demand is one's perceptive, lifelong labor, an incommensurable labor. It is in this linking of a good or coulddness, a good with otherness, that constitutes a dissensual ethical system. For it is by way of the coulddness of an intangible otherness that dissensus is demonstrated. A coulddness of a good, which I'll later discuss, comes by way of a wrong. Now, the effective quality of Critchley's perceived demand in approval and fidelity to a good is an aesthetic affinity, an affinity to that which can be sensed. Considering that a demand is aesthetic and must be perceived, the structure of the demand is always relational. It is precisely in this ethical structure of an internalized relation, the apprehension of a coulddness of the good, the perception of another potentiality, where Critchley calls into doubt the sovereignty of autonomy, calling the subject dividual. The dividual is an annex being. It is a self amalgamated by the demand of something other, an other that is not yet in existence, yet sensed as a good. Now, authors who are mistrustful of ethics in politics or art, like Rancière or Claire Bishop in her famous October essays, either link the concept of ethics to kind of do-gooder artist activities, or suggest that ethics has been wholly conjoined with ways of living that must adhere to given conditions if it is to be considered ethical at all. We can of course find much evidence to support this in their critique when the term is just kind of loosely tossed around, but this is by no means a ground to dismiss ethics tout court. What we can glean from their critique is a mistrust of a generalized ethics, which is ultimately linked to the collapse of situated judgment under a regime of morality turned law, displacing one's capacity for autonomous negotiation and acting otherwise. So what does it mean exactly to evoke autonomous judgment? When autonomy is defined as self-governance, what does it mean to govern oneself? Why is the association between autonomy and freedom as absolute total license so pervasive? And why is autonomy so often reduced to functions of the ego, to the me generation of the 60s and the my generation of the noughties? Considering that we are thrown into a world of undecidable plurality, an inescapable life of cohabitation into which we are all thrust, self-governance as a principle is impossible, for the self is always in and of the world. This condition is as unavoidable as gravity on earth. If the precondition of autonomy is a relation to, with, and in the world, how may it be redefined outside of the rule of the I? How may autonomy be supplemented with the demand of another or of being otherwise? I think there are key clues to this question caught up in the practices of the autonomia movement in Italy that began in the 50s and kind of concretized in the 70s. In autonomia, autonomy is positioned as a mode of collectivity through the co-determined nature of shaping one's own life rules. It's rhizomatic in structure and, quote, characterized by the refusal to separate economics from politics and politics from existence, end quote. So this can be witnessed by the inclusion of wageless laborers such as students and domestic workers within the framework of class struggle, which they're conventionally excluded from in sort of traditional Marxism. Autonomia becomes qualified as a kind of connective living fiber, not merely seeking policy reform in existing structures, but within the entanglement of complex modes of existence, with forms of life and the creation of worlds in which those very lives partake in simultaneity. Autonomy, in autonomia, is above all situated and relational, dramatically shifting away from island states of autarkic governance towards forms of life in common, tapping into the infinite reservoir of the virtual and not a particular structure of forms over life. I think there are palpable echoes of romanticism woven into autonomia's particular emphasis on modes of existence that can be traced back to Schiller's critique of the French Revolution. For Schiller, a quote, real revolution works radically upon the sensibility of the experience of life itself, undoing the polarities between a state of absolute non-governance and a state of outright moralism, the latter marked by the quasi-transcendental hand of law and the blind obedience to said law. The third state, or true revolution for Schiller, comes by way of play, what Schiller called play drive, Spieltrieb, defining it as essential to humanity. The play drive is where humans deploy imagination towards the autonomous invention of new rules of the game, and rules not blindly followed. In the process, they ascribe other uses and sensibilities to objects, forms, people, and places. In Schiller's revolutionary romanticism, and most importantly put into practice in autonomia, autonomy is a type of relational agency towards the creation of altered experiences of living, the enactment of a surplus perception and perceptibility in the face of a given limit of scarce behavior. So if autonomy is only political insofar as it can demonstrate other modes of existing, other modes of sense-making, other modes of creating signs and signification, this form of autonomy is not only pertaining to the self, but is shared. It's an effective autonomy. It is in this way that the desire for autonomy is not a sovereign desire, it is rather a certain drive of incommensurable communicability between the taskless decision to generate an experience of something other, another type of sensorium, and another that can perceive this potential otherness. So So autonomy is only political when it is non-sovereign in nature, that is, its capacity to generate a heterogeneous and shareable experience. With that in mind, we're left with the notion of autonomy that is at odds with sovereignty. I call this paradox co-autonomy. So with co-autonomy, I'm not trying to resolve the contradiction, but deploy it as an ethical concept articulating a position of tension between self and otherness, between spectatorship and action, between self and plural or potential world. Co-autonomy inheres the self, yet concurrently indicates a sphere of heterogeneous experience thus created. The witness of the co, which is a compounding of autonomy, is not extracted from the world as a sovereign agent, but is implicated in the relational experience of other sensorial orders as an agency of perception. The fidelity to a demand in this regard operates as a mode of being. It's a process, it's not a state, rather than a normative measure, or a demand that can be completely satisfied through action. In the words of Simon Critchley, it's infinitely demanding. So how can we conceive of those elusive demands as demands with regards to the non-sovereign nature of co-autonomy, to the sharing of alter sense? As a co-autonomous good is precisely what could be, it is of the domain of imagination. How does the fidelity to the imagination of the not yet there good manifest? The short answer is through critique. A good can be manifest in a critical impulse, but only insofar as one takes on the inaction of critique as a process and not a position of privileged knowledge. The type of critique talked about by Foucault and Judith Butler is not diagnostic or accusatory in nature, but is a space of resisting creation. The art of critique is equal to the creation of conditions for other life practices to emerge. For Foucault, critique is not definable apart from the object of its attention. As an ethic, there's no critique in general. Critique is always in relation to an object. It is always heteronymous, and it's always in the world. Foucault suggests a more vague instance of critique, not merely imposing evaluations on objects, but demonstrating the scaffold of the process of evaluation itself. As Judith Butler reiterates, how do our, quote, epistemological certainties turn out to support a way of structuring the world that forecloses alternative possibilities of ordering, end quote. Given the current plight of global neoliberal financialization, we may ask, through which epistemological structures have we become limited to Thatcher's alternative-less, no such thing as society world, for example? This art of critique arises under moments of epistemological duress, with the world into which we are thrust. When awareness presents itself that the partitioning of the sensible world produces a certain asymmetry to the exclusion of that which cannot be said, seen, heard, and done. This awareness renders the epistemological network of the social fundamentally contingent, and is here where the art of critique takes hold in what Butler calls a discursive impasse. When a regime of knowing, saying, and sense-making arrives at a dead end. The art of critique becomes synonymous with the practice of virtue, or dissensus, the making perceptible of a logical impasse inherent to the structure of existing normativity. The fidelity to an ethical good manifests through a critical inclination is equal to the discursive impasse that may be perceived in the given partitioning of the sensible. The articulation of this impasse, using the term from Rancière, goes by name of a wrong. It is the antagonistic bringing into relationship of the part with no part within a given symbolic ordering. This articulation of an appearance sets, quote, a community by the fact of placing in common a wrong that is nothing more than this very confrontation. The contradiction of two worlds in a single world, a world where they are and a world where they are not, end quote. Rancière uses the examples of the plebeians making their voice heard as speech and not merely as expressive noisy utterances in relationship to the ruling patricians in order to illustrate the setting in motion of a wrong as constitutive of a political relationship. The plebeians, in this case, tap into the inherent literarity of language to forge signals. The wrong is the creation of a heterogeneous sensory world in conjunction with a given territory of perceptibility. And in this regard, it is the spirit of fidelity to a could-ness and otherness articulated in the face of what is. The perception of the could-ness of a wrong in common, the articulation of an impasse or that which does not yet exist, as we've said, is a faculty of imagination. When the politicity of ethics is co-autonomous in nature, how is the imagination of a good or wrong rendered shareable as a sense of impasse rather than remaining a private sense? At work in this translation from private sense to shareable sense is the interplay between reasoned thinking and improvable belief. It's the interplay between the sign and the signified, the interplay between the rationality of Homo economicus and those animal spirits of market illogicality. The path of translation from private sense to shareable sense in relation to a demand of a good or wrong is a being under grace. Being under grace is the expression used by Badiou to indicate the path of the spirit in fidelity to the very articulation of a good-wrong in common. Being under grace is the opposite of being under law. It is a difference between a form of life and a form over life. For Badiou, the intangible force of fidelity to a good or wrong is qualified as a truth. Not because it's provable or known in a concrete way, but because the subject declares to be so and publicly speculates as to this declaration. This subject, Badiou continues, is a not ... but. The not can be understood as the sensible suspension of the given normative world, an impasse or a wrong, and the but is constitutive of the affirmation of a surplus, overfull repartitioning of the sensible world. The not of the subject perceives a demand of a good that inclines herself in fidelity to the relational demand, all within the realm of imagination. The but articulates this wrong in common through the creation of a sign, something sensible, something shareable, ascribing other significations to the given. It is in this movement where the given reality is made incomprehensible that the not but of the co-autonomous subject inscribes misunderstanding into the world. To misunderstand the given is nothing less than the creation of other potentialities for sense-making. The double signification of misunderstanding, as Rancière has noted, is both that of a failed apprehension and of disagreement based on the misinterpretation of signs. Depicting misunderstanding as a negative event reveals a will to solidify meaning, to freeze sense-making, to petrify the interpretation of gestures and modes of identification, projecting a world where words, images, people, and events define things and are definable absolutely. Misunderstanding rather affirms the contingencies among signs and semantics between what is given and what is potential. It disentangles the actual from the sensible constraints of unconditional reification. It is in this speculative work of creating conditions of and for sensory misunderstanding that demands a situated fidelity to an intangible good, a faithfulness to potential modes of sensibility in the face of a normative and consensual thrust towards semantic fixity. The given is a hegemonic condition through which common sense, so customs, virtues, common identities, and so forth, unites and binds particular communities. The economy of this hegemonic condition is, as we've discussed, not only actual but symbolic, logos and mythos, setting up a chain of equivalence between signs and signified, between things, people, places, functions, and values. This extended picture of economy in general mirrors the migration of economy, the oikos, as Antonia mentioned, from the domain of ancient household affairs to its omnipresence and utter dominance of the political sphere, the polis. As David Kishik writes, quote, "Today's world is not a cosmopolis, but more precisely an ecopolis, where economic and political forces operate as a single field of tensions without maintaining even the pretense that they are independent of one another," end quote. The ecopolis is a particular world buttressed by an economy of symbols, virtues, beliefs, and so forth. It cannot come into operation in any other way than through the consensual performance of these core elements. Consumption of finite objects is, of course, one of the core values from many in our current neoliberal ecopolis. But, as Maurizio Lazzarato points out, consumption cannot be reduced to the operation of buying and selling. For above all, this practice involves adhering to, and more importantly, understanding a particular world. Efforts at politicizing this world must begin with the presupposition of understanding a particular world, without falsely limiting the ecopolis to economic categories of use value and exchange value, which ultimately do nothing more than attempt to measure value in various ways of redistributing it. So in resurrecting the work of Gabriel Tal, Lazzarato places emphasis on the creation and constitution of values, beyond those that can be measured, such as truth value, pleasure value, beauty value, and so on. This reevaluation of value not only dissolves the dichotomy between material and immaterial labor, it situates the cooperation between brains as the principal force driving innovation. As Lazzarato states, quote, "Cooperation between minds, unlike cooperation in the Smithian and Marxian factory, produces public, collective, or common goods. Knowledge, language, science, culture, art, information, forms of life, relations with oneself, others in the world, etc." End quote. He distinguishes common goods from those outlined in political economy, such as water, air, and nature, to the goods of all that do not fall under producer-consumer relations, nor those of finite availability. These cooperative common goods, knowledge, language, experience of art, science, and so on, are inconsumable. They can be assimilated by anyone, but belong as a property to no one. And most importantly, their legitimacy increases by being imitated, taken up, and shared. As has been widely acknowledged, the sphere of cooperation of common goods has in itself been capitalized in the current state of affairs, and what Lazzarato calls the capital-labor relationship. Cooperative common goods, knowledge, language, science, culture, art, etc., are reduced to private property, with some calling this the communism of capital. In such a procedure, a false scarcity is imposed upon a productive, shared cooperation of minds that is fundamentally infinite, indivisible, and that is always already a surplus, for one cannot deplete the resource of language, for example. Considering the economy as not only the reproduction of ownable or rentable goods and services, but the particular life-world complex within which desires, beliefs, language, science, and sensibilities of communities circulate, the point of resistance cannot rest on the mere remeasurement and reattribution of wealth, but must work upon the transformation of the very life forms that subtend such practices. As Foucault makes abundantly clear, quote, "Life cannot become the object of power without it also becoming at the same time the basis for new forms of resistance." End quote. So it's in this very condition of a surplus value reduced to a scarcity that gives rise to an exemplary impasse, making the re-evaluation of value within the ecopolis acutely perceptible. So if, as the postmodernists would have it, there's no outside of the system and all alternatives will be subsumed within the given social order, it's a speculative work within the conflictual complex core, symbolic and material, where new life worlds can be formed and reassigned, working towards other imaginaries of a shareable good. It's on the precarious adjacency between forms over life, the capitalization of life, and forms of life, the excess energy of cooperative common goods, where the demand for ethics presents an urgent call to articulate, quote, "the contradiction of two worlds in a single world. The world where life is captured and the world where it expresses its inherent excessive potentiality." The ethical call, as it were, is towards the creation of alter signs, towards other economies of equivalence between sign and signified that buttress our apprehension and valuation of the world, towards the creation of misunderstanding. The creation of signs endures, even when actual events may stagnate. Signs endure in virtuality and have the quality of communicability. So at this moment when life seems caught in regimes of endless fiscalization, the real work begins with the reassignment of the force of living itself, an incommensurable force of living that is guided by the spirit of a shareable, imaginary being otherwise. This shared otherness is thrust into the world through the enactment of misunderstanding, affirming the contingencies among signs and semantics between what is given and what is potential. We can no longer delight in revealing the actual state of things and pointing our finger to all the negativity in the world, but must work to disentangle the actual from the sensibility that is a naturalized condition. The enactment of misunderstanding is precisely where the normative equivalences between object, gesture, thing, life, and value, physical or semantic, are rendered contingent, thrown into impasse and otherwise sensed. The affirmation of contingencies is nothing less than the enactment of the surplus innate to life and living itself, an articulation of life's virtualities, and this affirmation is always infinite. So, just about done. I'm going to close with some sort of thoughts that are in progress, that are still being worked out. But I have this sense that the movement I've been talking about is definitely not a revolutionary one. And I say that because we have to recall sort of the background of what revolution means. And we should not forget that Copernicus first used this word, this first time it was published, to describe cyclical repetitive planetary movement in 1543. So his revolution, of course, outlines predictable, calculable motion of celestial bodies. So the term, at least in English, always implies a return to origin. This return to origins is even mirrored in the political sense of revolution when it was first brought down to earth in lowly, dirty human affairs and used politically with the 1660 overthrow of the Rump Parliament and in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. So in both of these movements, the monarchy was restored into power, returned back to the origin of what was formerly there. With the word revolution historically linked to calculable cyclical motions of returning to a point of origin, there seems little space for the creation of novelty, for the creation of heterogeneous life experience or forms of life. What this movement suggests towards the surplus condition of infinite forms of life is a movement of eccentricity. So eccentricity describes a process of decentering. Ekkentos from the Greek literally means out of center. So what this movement of eccentricity indicates is the displacement of a very point of orientation. Now, if the good is considered as the normative core of given beliefs belonging to a shared idea of reality itself, the very challenge to this uniform point of orientation is not to replace it with something else, but to shift its gravitational weight. This eccentric space can only be articulated through the creation and sensibility of heterogeneous points of attractivity, towards which to incline. These other points of attractivity are equal to the sensibility of a good or wrong, which thrust us in other directions, rendering the centrifugal force of the form over life denaturalized. This sensibility of contingency requires the faculty of imagination. Imagination propelled by a decentered life under grace towards a shareable good or wrong. The fidelity to a good or wrong as an ethical demand is the effective inclination towards a decentered life, towards forms of life imagined beyond the fact of their anthropocentric limits. The space of eccentricity and the commitment to its potential creation is ultimately a misunderstanding of finitude as a necessary limit outlining a field of possible activity. It is the unfulfillable search and invention of modes of being that can be brought into sensory experience, demonstrating the very impasse those limits seem to contain. Thank you. Thanks for sticking around. I know it's dead.
Maybe now would be a good opportunity if anybody has any questions on any of the three presentations that you've held in your mind for a long time. Or we could alternatively now have a break and people can ask questions in a more informal way. Sounds good. Thank you very much, Patricia, Candice, and